I'm Thomas.
Maria Tsozi knelt in the freezing darkness of a desert cave, her newborn daughter cradled against her chest. The baby's mouth opened, about to cry for the first time. Maria's hand moved to cover that tiny mouth. One sound, just one cry, and the Comanchero scouts tracking her would find them both. They would sell her daughter into slavery, or worse, smash the infant's head against the rocks to stop the crying and salvage what profit they could from the mother alone. The baby's lungs filled with air. Maria's fingers trembled an inch from her daughter's face. This was the choice that no mother should ever have to make. Let your child cry and die, or silence her yourself, and maybe both of you survive until morning. The baby's eyes locked onto Maria's in the dim starlight filtering through the cave entrance. And Maria made her decision. But to understand how a Navajo mother came to be hiding in a cave, making impossible choices with a newborn who'd been born an hour earlier without a single sound, we must go back 5 days to the morning, when Maria's entire world ended in dust blood and the thunder of horses' hooves. The dawn came without mercy to the Navajo village, nestled in Canyon de Chelly. Maria Tsozi, 8 months pregnant, was grinding corn outside her hogan when she heard a sound like distant thunder, but the sky was clear. Her husband Hashk stood frozen beside their small flock of sheep, his hand shading his eyes as he stared toward the canyon entrance. Then they saw it, a wall of dust rising against the red cliffs, and within it the glint of rifle barrels catching the first light. Comanche, someone screamed, but Hashk knew better. The Comanche rode from the east. These riders came from the south, and they carried something worse than tribal vengeance. They carried the sanction of profit. The Comancheros burst into the village like a flood of violence. 20 riders, maybe 30, their horses' hooves drumming a rhythm of terror against the hard-packed earth. They wore an ugly mixture of Mexican and American clothing, their faces hidden behind bandanas stained with dust and old blood. Their leader, a scarred man the captives would later know only as El Lobo, raised his rifle and fired into the air. The shock was instantaneous. Children scattered like quail. Women grabbed for their babies. The few men who reached for weapons were cut down in seconds, efficient, brutal, final. Hash pushed Maria behind him, but a rifle butt to his temple sent him sprawling. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was his wife's terrified face as rough hands seized her arms. The sorting began immediately. El Lobo walked among the captives with the cold efficiency of a man selecting livestock. Old women left behind or shot. Men who survived the initial assault executed. Maria watched in numb horror as her neighbors, her friends, her family were divided into the living and the dead with casual gestures. A Comanchero grabbed her chin, turned her face side to side, then placed his hand on her swollen belly. He grinned, revealing broken teeth. Esta pre-ada pero joven. Vale algo. Pregnant, but young. Worth something. 23 women and children were bound and roped together. Maria's hands were tied behind her back, the hemp cutting into her wrists. A longer rope connected all the captives in a line, and with brutal efficiency the Comancheros mounted their horses and began to move. Behind them the village burned. The smoke carried the smell of her entire world ending. The desert didn't care about their names. It didn't care about their gods, their grief, or the smoke rising from the ruins of their village miles behind them. To the high desert of New Mexico, they were nothing but dying moisture moving across an anvil of stone. The journey to the slave markets was a 300-mile death march. The Comancheros set a pace designed to break animals, let alone human beings. They moved with the relentless rhythm of predators who knew the land better than they knew their own souls, 15 miles a day from the moment the sun bled over the horizon until the stars turned cold and indifferent overhead. For Maria Tsozi, 8 months, heavy with a child that should have been born in the warmth of a hogan, every step was a war. The rope binding the captives was a single cruel spine connecting 23 women and children. It was short enough to force them to march in lockstep, but long enough that if one stumbled, the shockwave jerked the necks of 3 others. Maria walked in the middle of the line, her hands bound behind her back with raw buffalo hide that tightened as it dried. She had learned the arithmetic of survival on the second day. It happened when an elder, a grandmother named So, stumbled. She didn't cry out, she simply folded her legs, turning to water. The line jerked to a halt. The dust settled. El Lobo rode back his horse, stepping delicately over the sagebrush. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He looked down at the old woman with the bored expression of a man checking a lame mule. He spoke one word to his lieutenant, Lastra. Dead weight. The gunshot was deafening in the canyon silence. There was no burial. They simply cut the rope, kicked the body into a ditch for the coyotes, and the whip cracked. Moo. Maria didn't look back. She couldn't. She understood now that pity was a luxury they could no longer afford. The equation was simple. Motion is life. Stillness is death. Inside her, the baby seemed to understand the terror of their new reality. For months the child had been active, kicking against her ribs like a wild pony. But since the screaming started, the baby had gone still. It was a terrifying conspiratorial silence. I will be small, the child seemed to say. I will be quiet. Just carry us. Scheiße, Maria, whispered the word, barely a breath of air moving through cracked lips. We are invisible. We are stone. But promises made to the unborn are fragile things when the body begins to rebel. On the 5th day, the terrain shifted from flat scrubland to the jagged, broken teeth of the foothills. The air grew thinner. The shadows grew longer. And Maria felt the first ripple of betrayal from her own body. It started as a dull ache in her lower back, a tightening that wrapped around her hips like a heated iron band. She missed a step, the rope biting into her neck. No, she thought, panic flaring brighter than the pain. Not now. Not here. But the biology of birth waits for no one. 10 minutes later, the second contraction hit. It was sharper this time, a hook dragging through her abdomen. Her breath hitched. The woman ahead of her, a neighbor she had known all her life, cast a terrified glance over her shoulder. She saw the sweat sheeting on Maria's pale face, saw the way Maria bit her lip until a thin line of blood trickled down her chin. She knew. They both knew. If the Comancheros realized Maria was going into labor, they wouldn't stop the column. They wouldn't bring water. They would see a slowing asset, a pregnant woman who would slow them down for days. They would see Lastra. Maria forced her legs to move. Left foot. Breathe. Right foot. Don't scream. The pain became a rhythmic hammer. She began to time them. Every 400 steps, the world would turn white with agony. She had to exhale slowly through her nose, locking her knees to keep from collapsing, while her face remained a mask of stone. The baby was coming. Today. Tonight. She studied the landscape with the desperate eyes of a trapped wolf. The column was entering a narrow pass known as the Devil's Throat. Massive boulders of sandstone, red as dried blood, littered the trail. Pion trees twisted from the rock faces like gnarled hands. The sun was dipping low, casting long, confusing shadows. This was her only chance. Maria watched the guards. 3 scouts rode far ahead. The main body of captors rode alongside the line. But the danger lay behind. 2 men, the cleaners, rode 50 yards back, smoking cigarettes, their rifles resting lazily across their saddles. Their job was to catch stragglers. Or end them. Maria made her plan. It was a plan born of madness, but she had no other currency left to spend. She caught the eye of the girl behind her, little Desba, who was barely 12. Maria whispered in Navajo, her voice a ghost of sound. When I fall, do not look. Do not stop. Pull the rope tight to hide the slack." Desba's eyes went wide, swimming with tears, but she gave a tiny, imperceptible nod. Another contraction seized Maria strong enough to nearly buckle her knees. She used the momentum. As the column wound around a massive monolithic slab of rock that temporarily blocked the view of the rear guards, Maria made her move. She didn't slip the rope off. That was a fantasy. The guards had tied it tight. She had to brute force her freedom. Maria planted her feet and ducked her head, shoving the loop of rough hemp upward against her jaw. It caught on her chin. She shoved harder, ignoring the abrasion. The rope slid up, catching behind her ears. It was too tight. It wouldn't go over. She could hear the hoofbeats of the rear guards approaching. Clop, clop, clop. With a silent primal snarl, Maria yanked the rope upward with the full force of her neck muscles. The rough fibers sawed into her flesh. She felt the skin behind her ears. Tyr felt the warm slick of blood, felt the cartilage of her ears folding, crushing, and then with a wet snap, the loop tore over her skull. She was free of the line. She didn't breathe. She didn't celebrate. She threw herself sideways, diving into a narrow fissure at the base of the sandstone slab, rolling into the dust just as the shadow of the rear guard fell over the trail. She curled into a ball, pressing her face into the dirt, pulling her bound hands as close to her body as possible. She was visible if they looked down. She was dead if they stopped. The hoofbeats grew louder. The ground vibrated against her cheek. Keep walking, she prayed to the universe. Just keep walking. The first horse passed, but the second one slowed. Maria's heart hammered against her ribs so hard she was sure the sound would echo off the canyon walls. The horse stopped directly in front of her hiding spot. She froze. Through the slit of her eyelids she could see the horse's fetlocks, dusty and scarred. She could smell the animal's sweat, pungent and heavy. The horse lowered its head. A massive velvet nostril sniffed at the crevice where she lay. It smelled the blood from her torn ears. It smelled the fear. The horse snorted a loud, wet sound and pawed the ground. Dust showered down onto Maria's face. She didn't blink. She didn't twitch. Above her, the guard shifted in his saddle. Leather creaked, the sound of a match striking against a boot heel. The smell of tobacco smoke drifted down. He was right there, 5 feet above her. All he had to do was look down. A contraction hit Maria then, a tidal wave of agony that started in her spine and wrapped around her belly. It was the strongest one yet. Her body screamed to arch, to gasp, to writhe. Maria shoved her face into the dirt, biting down on her own tongue. She locked every muscle in her body, turning herself into a statue of pain. The taste of copper filled her mouth. She suffocated the scream in her throat until her vision blurred with black spots. "Oi!" the other guard shouted from further up the trail. "Vi manos, let the stragglers rot." The guard above her spat. A glob of saliva landed on the rock inches from Maria's hair. "Malditos, caballos," he muttered. He kicked the horse. The animal grunted, turned, and galloped to catch up. Maria lay there for a long time, listening as the sounds of the horses, the creak of leather, and the shuffling misery of the captives faded into the distance. Only when the silence of the desert returned absolute and terrifying did she allow herself to exhale. She gasped, sucking in air that tasted of dust and freedom. She rolled onto her back, looking up at the first stars blinking into existence. She was free. She was alone. Her hands were still bound behind her back. She had no water, no weapon, and she was 300 miles from home. And then another pain ripped through her sharper than a knife. Water gushed between her legs, soaking her dress. The escape was over. The ordeal had just begun. Maria's body gave her perhaps an hour before the contractions became overwhelming. She used every minute. With her hands still bound behind her, she worked her way deeper into a cluster of boulders, until she found a narrow cleft barely wide enough for her swollen body that led to a small cave beneath an overhang. She squeezed inside and immediately set about freeing her hands. The Comancheros had tied them with rawhide, but Maria had been working the binding loose for days, letting blood and sweat soften the leather. She found a sharp edge on the cave wall and rubbed frantically, until finally, blessedly, one hand pulled free. She had no water, no knife, no warmth, nothing but her own body and the knowledge passed down through generations of Navajo women who had birthed babies in circumstances only slightly less desperate than these. The sun was setting when the serious contractions began. Maria stuffed a piece of leather from her torn moccasin into her mouth and bit down hard. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, wave after wave that seemed determined to split her in half. But she made no sound. The Comanchero scouts might double back. Wolves and coyotes prowled these hills. Silence was survival. Night fell. Stars emerged cold and indifferent above the desert. Maria labored alone in the darkness, her hands gripping stone, her teeth clenched around leather, her whole being focused on the impossible task of bringing life into a world that wanted them both dead. When the baby finally came sliding into her trembling hands in a rush of fluid and blood, Maria's first thought was terror. Why isn't it crying? But then she felt the small chest expand, felt the tiny heart beating strong against her palm, and understood her daughter was born, already knowing the first rule of survival. Silence. Maria cut the umbilical cord with a sharp stone, tied it off with a strip torn from her dress, and brought the baby to her breast. The infant latched on immediately, nursing with a quiet intensity that broke Maria's heart and filled it simultaneously. She named her daughter Awi, Tosi, baby, precious, and as the night deepened around them, Maria made another promise: we're going home, Shaizay. Whatever it takes, we're going home. But home was 300 miles away, through territory now hostile to her very existence. And between here and there lay winter's starvation and the same desert that had swallowed countless others who'd tried to survive its indifference. Thomas Rivera had lost everything that mattered to him 2 years before Maria stumbled half-dead toward his sheep camp. His wife Esperanza and their son Miguel had died when a stray bullet from a skirmish between Union soldiers and Confederate raiders tore through their small adobe home. He'd been out with the sheep when it happened. He came back to find them already cold. The army said it was an accident. Apologized. Offered him $20 in compensation. Thomas took the money because he needed it to bury them, but something inside him died with his family that day. The man who remained was hollow, competent at keeping sheep alive, at surviving the harsh New Mexico winters, but empty of everything else. He'd moved his camp higher into the mountains, away from roads and settlements, away from soldiers and their wars, away from everything except the wind and the sheep and his solitude. Which is why on that frozen December morning, when he found the woman and child collapsed in the snow 200 yards from his camp, his first instinct was to walk away. She was clearly Navajo. He could see that even from a distance. And she was clearly running from something, probably the army roundups he'd heard about. Harboring her would be suicide. They'd hang him if they found out, or at the very least, burn his camp and scatter his sheep. Thomas stood for a long moment, the wind cutting through his wool coat, watching the woman try to rise and fail. The baby made no sound, bundled against her chest. Then he saw Esperanza's face in his memory. Heard her voice: Thomas, we don't turn away from people in need. That's not who we are. But I'm not who we were anymore, he said aloud to the empty air. The woman collapsed again. The snow was beginning to fall harder. Thomas cursed in Spanish, in English, and in a few choice words he'd picked up from the Navajo traders. Then he shouldered his rifle, walked down to where she lay, and without a word picked up both woman and child and carried them toward his camp. The woman was barely conscious, mumbling in Navajo. The baby was too quiet, a bad sign. Thomas had seen enough lambs die from exposure to know that silence in an infant wasn't peaceful. It was the body shutting down. His camp was modest, a small adobe dwelling built into a hillside, a corral for the sheep, a shed for supplies. Simple, defensible, and most importantly, invisible from the main trails. He'd chosen this location for isolation, never imagining it might become a refuge. The first thing he did before even opening the door was walk his sheep back and forth across the trail multiple times. Their hooves obliterated the woman's tracks and his own boot prints. It wouldn't fool a dedicated tracker, but it might cause a cursory patrol to ride past. Inside, he laid them near the fire, but not too close. Too much heat too fast could kill someone frozen nearly solid. He'd learned that with a lamb once. The woman's eyes fluttered open. She saw him saw the rifle leaning against the wall, and terror flooded her face. She grabbed for the baby protectively. Thomas held up his hands and spoke the few words of Navajo he knew: friend. Help. Safe. His pronunciation was terrible, but she seemed to understand. Or maybe she was just too exhausted to resist. He took off his gun belt and placed it across the room, a gesture he hoped she'd recognize. Then he heated water and brought her a cup of weak broth from the beans he'd been cooking. She drank it desperately, water spilling down her chin. The baby made a small mewing sound, and Thomas saw the woman's face transform with relief. The child was alive enough to cry. Only when he was certain they weren't going to die in the next hour did Thomas allow himself to think about what he'd just done, and the immense danger they were all now in. The first week was silence. Maria was too weak to do more than feed her daughter and sleep. Thomas was too uncertain to do more than provide basic necessities and watch the horizon nervously for dust clouds. They communicated in gestures and the fragments of each other's languages. Thomas pointed fire, water, food. Maria nodded or shook her head. The baby miraculously seemed to be thriving despite everything, or perhaps because of the warmth, food, and rest after her nightmare birth. Thomas named her Peak A, in his mind Little One, because he didn't know her Navajo name and didn't ask. On the 8th day he heard riders. He was outside when the sound reached him, the distinctive rhythm of cavalry horses at a trot. Thomas's blood turned to ice. He ran inside and found Maria already moving the baby, clutched to her chest, her eyes wild. He gestured frantically toward the root cellar, a hole barely 3 feet deep used for storing potatoes and turnips in winter. Maria didn't hesitate. She climbed down into that dark space, and Thomas replaced the wooden boards, threw a worn sheepskin over them, and dragged his heavy table on top. Then he scattered cornmeal on the floor and kicked a bench over to make the house look naturally messy. He grabbed his shepherd's crook and walked outside, trying to look casual despite his racing heart. 3 soldiers approached, a lieutenant and 2 scouts. The scouts wore the distinctive clothing of Ute trackers working for the army. Thomas's stomach sank further. If anyone could detect Maria's presence, it would be them. "You there?" the lieutenant called. "You speak English, some see," or Thomas replied, leaning on his crook and affecting the posture of a simple shepherd. "We're searching for escaped hostiles from the roundup. Navajo woman, possibly with a child." "You seen anyone like that?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, see or is just me and my sheep here. Nobody else for many miles." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed. "You mind if we look inside?" Thomas's heart hammered, but he knew refusing would be worse. "Of course, Seor. Is small house, but you look." The soldiers dismounted and pushed past him. Thomas followed, trying to breathe normally, trying not to look at the table that concealed the root cellar. Inside, the Ute scouts moved with unsettling efficiency, their eyes taking in every detail. One of them picked up a piece of wool yarn from the floor, the kind Maria had been using to weave. He held it up to the light, studying it. Thomas forced himself to speak calmly. "Is from my sheep, Seor. I try to spin wool sometimes, but I am very bad at it." He laughed weakly. The scout said nothing, just dropped the yarn and continued his inspection. He walked directly to the table, stood there for a moment. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Could the scout hear it too? Could he hear the terrified breathing of the woman and child beneath the floor? The Ute placed his hand on the table's surface, seemed about to lift it. Then one of the other soldiers called from outside, "Lieutenant, found tracks heading west, looks recent." The scout's attention shifted. He followed the others out, and Thomas exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. The lieutenant mounted his horse. "If you see anything, you report it to Fort Sumner." "Understood. There's a reward for information." "Yes, see or." "I understand." They rode west, following whatever tracks they'd found, probably from a coyote or deer, but Thomas offered a silent prayer of thanks to every saint he could remember. He waited a full hour after they disappeared before lifting the table. When he opened the root cellar, he found Maria curled around her daughter in complete darkness, tears streaming down her face, one hand clamped over the baby's mouth to keep her from making any sound. She'd been ready to suffocate her own child rather than let her cry out and doom them all. Thomas helped them out of the hole, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Maria spoke to him, broken Spanish mixed with Navajo. "Gracias. Gracias por vida." "Thank you for life." Thomas had no words. He just nodded and helped her to the fire. Winter deepened, and with it Maria began to heal, not just in body, but in spirit. The constant terror that had driven her since the raid began to ease, replaced by the rhythms of sheep camp life. She observed Thomas carefully at first, understanding that she owed him everything, but also knowing that debt could be dangerous. In her culture, a gift creates obligation, and obligation creates connection. She needed to transform this relationship from charity to partnership, from rescued to invaluable. She started small. Thomas's attempts at cooking were functional but joyless, beans cooked until they were mush, cornmeal mixed with water, and nothing else. One morning while he was out with the sheep, Maria took over the preparation of the atoll he'd been making. She added a pinch of salt she found in his stores, a scraping of piloncillo sugar, and ground the blue corn more finely on his metate. When Thomas returned and tasted it, his eyes widened. This is like what Esperanza used to make," he said softly, then fell silent, retreating into his memories. But Maria had seen the crack in his armor. Next came the wool. Thomas sheared his sheep and sold the raw fleece for pennies. Maria saw the potential being wasted. She began the painstaking process of washing wool, using yucca root she dug from the hillside, the same plant that had sustained her in the desert. Thomas watched in fascination as she created soap from the plant's roots, cleaned the wool to a pristine white he'd never achieved, and then began spinning it using a drop spindle she made from a stick and a stone. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. Maria understood enough Spanish now to respond, "My mother." Her mother. All the mothers before. She paused, then added, "I teach you if you want." Thomas shook his head. "My hands are too rough for such work." "Your hands shear sheep and deliver lambs." "That is not rough. That is skilled." Something in her words seemed to reach him. For the first time, Thomas smiled, a small, sad smile, but genuine. The real transformation came during lambing season. One of Thomas's ewes was struggling with a breech birth, the lamb positioned wrong. Thomas was preparing to lose both animals when Maria knelt beside the struggling sheep and began to work with a confidence born of experience. She spoke softly in Navajo to the terrified ewe, her hands gentle but sure as she maneuvered the lamb into position. 20 minutes later, a healthy lamb emerged, and the ewe licked it clean while Maria sat back exhausted but triumphant. Thomas stared at her. "You saved them." "Sheep are sacred," Maria replied simply. "We do not let them die if we can help them live." From that day forward, they worked together as partners. Maria handled the medical care of the flock, found hidden water sources by reading the landscape, and created wool products that Thomas could sell for 10 times what he'd gotten for raw fleece. Thomas provided protection, shelter, and gradually something more precious, trust. Her daughter Awi grew strong despite the hardships of her birth. She rarely cried. That early lesson of silence had imprinted deep, but she was alert and curious, watching everything with dark, intelligent eyes. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day, Thomas picked up the baby and bounced her gently. Awi grabbed his finger and held on with surprising strength. "She's a fighter," Thomas said. "She had to be," Maria replied. Then carefully she asked the question that had been growing in her mind. "Your family. What happened?" Thomas's face closed, and Maria thought she'd made a terrible mistake. But then slowly he began to speak. He told her about Esperanza, about Miguel, about the bullet that ended everything, about the hollow years since. When he finished, Maria was crying silently. "We have both lost everything," she said. "No," Thomas replied, looking at Awi. "Not everything. Not yet. They had 7 months. 7 months of careful peace, of learning each other's languages and stories, of building something fragile but real in the isolation of the high desert. Then the cavalry returned. This time there was no warning. Thomas was in the far pasture with most of the flock when he heard the shots. He ran toward the house, his heart in his throat, and arrived to see 5 soldiers dragging Maria from the adobe, while Awi screamed in her arms. "No," Thomas shouted, raising his rifle. The sergeant turned toward him, casually raising his own weapon. "Drop it, mister, or we drop you." Thomas hesitated, his rifle wavering. One of the Ute scouts stepped forward and spoke. "This woman is wanted criminal. She escaped from custody. You help her, you hang with her. She's not a criminal, she's a mother." Who? The rifle butt to his stomach ended his protest. Thomas collapsed, gasping, as they bound Maria's hands. She wasn't fighting, wasn't resisting. Her eyes found his across the yard, and in them he saw not fear, but a terrible, resigned understanding. They were going to take her back to Bosque Redondo, the concentration camp where thousands of Navajo were dying of disease and starvation. And they were going to take Awi too. The baby was crying now, screaming for the only father she'd ever known. "Pop, pop!" Thomas struggled to his feet despite the pain. "Please," he gasped. "The child, she's done nothing. Let her stay with me." The sergeant laughed. "That's a Navajo baby, friend. She belongs with her people. We're doing her a favor. Her people are dead. I'm all she has. Should have thought of that before you decided to play house with a hostile." The sergeant nodded to his men. "Load them up. We've got 5 more camps to search before dark." They tied Maria to a horse and placed Awi in her arms. As they prepared to ride out, Maria called to Thomas in Spanish, "Find us the camp at Bosque Redondo, please." Then they were gone, dust rising in their wake, and Thomas was alone in front of his adobe home, with blood in his mouth and his heart breaking for the 2nd time in his life. Thomas Rivera was not a brave man. He was not a hero. He was a widower who raised sheep and tried to survive in a hard land. But he was also a man who had learned that doing nothing in the face of evil is itself a form of evil. He sold everything: the sheep, the camp, every possession except his horse, his rifle, and what money he could raise. Then he began the 150-mile journey to Bosque Redondo. The camp was worse than he'd imagined. Thousands of Navajo crowded into makeshift shelters along the Pecos River, living in conditions that would shame any civilized nation. Disease, hunger, and despair hung over the place like a visible cloud. Thomas couldn't enter the camp. Civilians were turned away by armed guards. But he waited outside for 3 days until he spotted a Navajo woman collecting water from the river. He approached carefully, holding out a silver coin. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "Maria Tsosi. With a baby, maybe 8 months old. Do you know her?" The woman's eyes were hollow with suffering, but she studied him carefully. "Why do you want to find her?" "Because." Thomas hesitated, then told the truth. "Because she's my family." Something in his voice must have convinced her. She took the coin. "Section D, near the east wall." A shelter with a blue blanket at the entrance. But see, or the soldiers, they watch everything. I know, Thomas said. He found the shelter that night approaching in darkness. He called softly. Maria, a figure emerged from the shadows, thinner, harder, but unmistakably her. And in her arms a wee who reached for him immediately. Thomas's eyes filled with tears as he held the child. I came to get you out. Maria shook her head. Is impossible. They watch too closely. And where would we go? The army has decreed all Navajo must be here. There is no safe place for us anywhere. Mexico, Thomas said. I have money. Enough to get us across the border, start somewhere new. With a wanted Navajo woman and a mixed-blood child, Thomas, they will find us. Maybe. But maybe not. And even if they do, he looked at a wee who was grabbing his beard and smiling. Isn't it worth trying? Isn't freedom worth the risk? Maria stood silent for a long moment, then the fence. Section D, where the river runs closest. The guards change at midnight. We have maybe 10 minutes. I'll be there with horses. If we're caught, they'll kill you. If I leave you here, I'm already dead. Just slower. The escape was a blur of terror and desperate action. Thomas created a diversion by starting a small fire in the supply shed on the west side of camp. While soldiers rushed to contain it, Maria cut through the fence wire with pliers Thomas had smuggled to her. She squeezed through a wee strapped to her back and ran toward where Thomas waited with 2 horses. They mounted and rode into the darkness, expecting bullets in their backs at any moment. None came. By the time the alarm was raised, they were 3 miles away and riding hard toward the Mexican border. The journey took 4 days of hard travel, avoiding roads, sleeping in arroyos, living on dried meat and water from scattered springs that Maria's knowledge of the land helped them find. They crossed the Rio Grande on a moonless night, the water cold and chest-deep on the horses. On the far bank in the country that would become their refuge, Thomas pulled Maria and a wee close. We made it, he breathed. No, Maria corrected gently. We are making it. Every day we choose to make it. Epilogue. 8 years later, the small rancho south of Chihuahua was nothing special, a modest adobe house, a flock of sheep, an orchard that struggled in the arid climate. But to the family that lived there it was everything. Thomas Rivera, now gray-bearded and weathered, watched, as his daughter, for that was how he thought of a wee, now helped her mother card wool. At 9 years old she moved between Spanish, English, and Navajo with the ease of a child born between worlds. She was learning her mother's weaving, her father's shepherding, and creating her own path through a life that had started in blood and silence, but had found its way to something resembling peace. Maria saw her husband, watching, and smiled. It was a hard-won smile, carrying the weight of everything they'd survived, but genuine nonetheless. What are you thinking? She asked. That I was dead, Thomas replied. And then I found you dying. And somehow we both lived. Not somehow, Maria corrected, pulling him close. We chose to live. Every day we chose each other, we chose our daughter. We chose to believe that there was something worth fighting for beyond mere survival. That evening, as the sun set over their small rancho, they gathered around the table, a family built from ashes, sustained by love, and held together by the simple, profound decision to keep choosing life, even when the world seemed determined to choose death. A wee, practicing her letters, looked up at her parents. Mom, Pop, tell me again how you met Thomas and Maria, exchanged glances, and in that look was everything: the horror of the raid, the miracle of the birth, the terror of discovery, and the courage of escape. It's a long story, Thomas said. We have time, a wee replied, with the confidence of a child who has never known anything but safety and love. And so they told it again, this story of survival and sacrifice of 2 people who lost everything and found each other in the ruins. A story that began with silence and ended with family, proving that even in the darkest moments of history, humanity's capacity for compassion can create light. The sheep grazed peacefully in the twilight. The fire crackled warm in the hearth. And a family that had every reason to break instead bent survived and ultimately thrived, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of choosing love over hatred, hope over despair.